Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. This is you have a wonderful group of people here from around the world, and it's a big pleasure to talk about some of these issues. And, I'm not going to give too much in the way of absolutely clear guidance, but maybe raise a few questions and challenges that we've been grappling with, and I'm sure that everybody else has been grappling with in this work, and hopefully we can have a conversation about sharing some good practices. So I'm speaking to you now in Italy. I'm at a field project right now, and I work in support of field data management for this project at Poggio Civitate, and which is just south of Siena in Italy. But normally I live and work in Berkeley, California, which is unceded territory of indigenous peoples, the Wichin, Chechenian-speaking Ohlone people in California. And it's also of great importance to the territory I live in. It's great importance to the Makemwa Ohlone tribe. And this framing about the sort of colonial history of the place that I live in California is important because it's same kinds of issues that we are grappling with when we think about the history of a place like California, which has experienced waves of colonial empires from Spain, Mexico, Europe, and then now the United States. That historical context is also part and parcel of the context of how we conduct research, especially historical research, archaeological research. And though that context creates important challenges in data management. And that's mainly the kinds of issues that I'd like to speak about today. So as Rebecca noted, I work with Open Context, and Open Context has been a data publishing service for archaeology since 2006 is when we first launched the platform and the service, and it's gone through several iterations of software development since then. We have roughly approaching now 200 different archaeological projects. These include excavations and field surveys, sometimes collections research, and it's roughly around 2 million now named entities that we've been publishing. And we work in collaboration with a broader ecosystem of other information services. So very important for us is the California Digital Library, which is part of the University of California system. And they provide repository services, so digital archiving services, and also persistent ID services, so that the entities that we publish can be have names and resolution that can outlive our own website, basically. And that's something that I want to return to in the future. We've been around for a while. We've played roles in data curation and have recognition from the library world for digital curation, have some recognition also from archaeologists. And in 2013, the Obama White House recognized our work in promoting openness in the humanities and the social sciences. We're an open access, open data repository, and one of our main emphasis has been sort of on that FAIR question. So I'll get into some of the issues of interoperability, open data, and that kind of thing. But as you can see, just from the name Open Context, we're probably emphasizing a lot in the way of openness in the world of data and access. That said, as we've been working on this project now for really about 20 years, the challenges that we face and the challenges that our whole community face are really steep and very severe. So obviously, one of the main emphasis of this talk is going to be focusing on this first challenge, the ethical challenge. There are clear issues of colonialism, entrenched biases. We do not want to reinforce and recapitulate in an online environment a lot of the harms that have been done historically and ongoing that have been associated with colonialism. At the same time, because of the opportunities available to us through online technologies, data management, and the infrastructure available to us with open source software using tools like Arches and whatnot, there are important opportunities for diversified engagement, for new voices to be brought in to engage with the archaeological past and to create new stories with the archaeological past. And that's important for research, for education, for public engagement, and make this more participatory. So yes, there are dangers associated with this. There are also opportunities, and we want to make sure that we try to promote those opportunities while we reduce risks of harm as we use these digital technologies. And then there are also other important challenges. Obviously, there are semantic challenges. The archaeological past, any historical discipline in the humanities is very complicated because we're dealing with humans and human culture. And there's very little consensus, lots of different disciplines we have to consider. So there are important semantic challenges, obvious challenges in technology, especially when we look at the fact that there's uneven infrastructure around the world, and technology infrastructure that might be appropriate in one place may not be appropriate in another place. So there's a great deal of interesting work that needs to be done in that space. And then, of course, capacity. So some of the most important challenges are human capacity, that resources, skills, experience in working with data, these types of things are unevenly distributed and quite scarce in our discipline. So those are some of the framing challenges. And just to highlight a little bit about how we've been navigating it. And I want to just highlight at the outset, I don't think we've been particularly successful in navigating all of these challenges. And, explain a little bit about why, we do open data. And one of the reasons why we do open data with open context is we don't really feel like we have the capacity to engage in a responsible manner with more sensitive kinds of information. And that's because we really don't have the resources to handle a lot of the technical and administrative challenges, and especially the governance challenges in managing sensitive information, especially when considering that legitimate authority, the knowledge to understand what are the sensitivity issues. These things require a huge amount of expertise, cultural expertise. And in order for that to happen, you need to have those cultural experts engaged and involved in that in the governance of that information. All of that actually does require a great deal of time, effort, and resources. And those resources really translate into financial resources. And it's a really important and key challenge, especially when we think about implementing the CARE principles, which I'll discuss a little bit more in a very meaningful way. We're also a small, independent, nonprofit organization, an NGO. And we have limited capacity if there are legal issues, legal risks associated with it. So things like liability, what happens if something bad happens, if data leaks and it leads to bad consequences. So these are also important challenges. And one of the reasons why we've open context, we focus mainly on open data, is really as a risk reduction because we feel like we lack the capacity to responsibly engage with more sensitive information. Now, a little bit of the history and how we've been working with some of these kinds of issues. In 2007, I co-authored a paper with some colleagues, Arish Bissell, who's an expert in education, Jason Schultz, who's an intellectual property lawyer and expert, and this is even before we put the first data online or wrote the first line of code for open context. But basically, we recognized that there are important challenges in open data, and the appropriateness of openness is not necessarily universal. And part and parcel of that is because cross-culturally, there are differences in how people understand what is sensitive, what is sacred, what is proper, what would be considered private, and what can be shared and with whom. And those cross-cultural differences are an important challenge that we all are facing now. And so one of the first papers we wrote around this is thinking about something like a Creative Commons model for expressing some of these notions of what is proper and what's not, and how things can be shared with certain limitations associated with it. And I see there's a hand up, so should I pause? Is Kansa, Ashraf? I see your hand. Do you have a question? Okay. I'll keep speaking because I don't hear the question. So there's some similar follow-up work that I want to also highlight. There's an important project, if you're interested in some of these issues, called iPinch, the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage, that was organized out of Simon Fraser University, and it ran from 2008 to 2016. There is an impressive body of literature and case studies that project has developed that it really is useful for trying to understand some of these issues, and also to try to frame some ideas of good practice in thinking through a lot of the challenges that we're facing with this. And we've actually used this project, we participated in this project, and we've used the project to help shape some of the user interface issues in open context. So some of our terms of use, our editorial and IP policies, even some user interface design was informed by this, by work in collaboration with the iPinch project. And one of the other strategies that we've been trying to adopt is, are there places or ways in which more open data can interface and augment or complement more sensitive data that is going to be curated elsewhere, maybe in more specific systems, systems with better governance specific for the data that they're curating. And one example of this is something called the Digital Index of North American Archaeology, where we have very low specificity, low risk and for open data that we're sharing, but we point toward more sensitive, we point towards other information systems that are managing the more sensitive data, and those other systems are managing access and authorization and access controls around who can see that more sensitive information. So in some ways, it's a sort of a federated model. Anyway, this is just a little bit of background about how we've been trying to struggle with this, and you can see there are probably gaps, and there are probably there's a lot of iteration. So we're trying to learn as our project continues. We're trying to learn and trying to improve our practices, and really what's so essential about that is really talking and engaging with a wider community. And we're really one of the best examples of that's just iPinch, which is a project that I really urge you to take a look at, and we're really grateful for the guidance that they were able to offer. Now, as Rebecca has started with the introductions, there's the FAIR data and the CARE principles are this sort of like two of the main guiding principles for sort of good practice in the world of archaeological data management. And I'm going to go into some of the more specifics of those and highlight some areas of tension and some complementarities between them. Okay. So first of all, the FAIR data principles, you're probably all familiar with it: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And these principles are, as you can see, that they're fairly technocratic and data-centric. So the main point of the FAIR data principles is imagining data to be mainly fungible. And it's actually, data is most valuable if it can freely flow fungibly and be aggregated from multiple places, be brought together for reuse. And a lot of that reuse is imagined in the world of research to be some sort of research outcomes, but there, you could also imagine educational public outreach outcomes from FAIR data also. And the main emphasis on FAIR programmatically is to reduce the frictions and the encumbrances on those data. So anything that sort of makes things less efficient, makes things harder, those are bad in the perspective of FAIR. And to promote interoperability and reuse, there's a lot of emphasis on the implementation of technical standards. So things like standard APIs, if you're familiar with JSON and GeoJSON, and even semantic standards like the SIDOC CRM. And also standard licenses that promote interoperability. Licenses like Creative Commons licenses, which allow, which make the data that you're sharing in a fair context promote the interoperability because they are compatible with respect to intellectual property. And sort of the cultural background of FAIR is a lot of it is coming from the sort of free culture, the libre culture movements, open source, open science, open access. And there's a suspicion of authority and suspicion of gatekeepers and a suspicion of IP entanglements because there's a sort of, it's those movements in some way are a lot of reaction against a lot of the sort of abuses of major media companies, especially in the United States, companies like Disney, or you can imagine the world of research, big publishing company, commercial publisher like Elsevier, where there's a monopolization of intellectual property held by these giant international companies. And they see that as an important source of inequality and risk of having our cultural heritage being owned by a corporate entity is something that they've been trying to work against. So I want to highlight, though, that the FAIR data is not just technocratic, but there is an ethical vision and there is a history behind that is interesting to think about. There are some tensions, though. There's also obviously not all the benefits of FAIR data are going to be unevenly distributed. So not everybody has the same capacity to be able to enjoy the benefits of having free access to all sorts of interoperable data. There are technical issues, there are skills issues, there are infrastructure issues that make it so that some people will enjoy more benefits than others. And then there are also obvious issues around privacy and security. And as we'll speak about, those are cross-culturally quite complicated. And that's where care becomes an important kind of a concern. And speaking of that, there's some interesting work already. So Stephanie Carroll and colleagues who published the care data principles sort of outline some of the thematically organized, charted some of the main sorts of data frameworks, data principles, good practices frameworks, and classify them according to, are they oriented around benefiting communities for the purposeful reuse of the data, or is it really focused mainly on data? And some of these frameworks like the Open Data Charter, Fair Data Principles, something called STREAM, these are really very much so data oriented. And that's work that Stephanie Carroll did when she was introducing the care data principles. And when you start looking at information management principles in the context of managing indigenous data, then you can start to see a very different kind of a picture. So in New Zealand, Australia, United States, and Canada, some of the frameworks that have been proposed before this sort of synthesis of the care data principles, you see that there's very much less data orientation and much more people and purpose orientation. And that's a really important thing when you start thinking about why the care data principles are the way they are and how they're different from FAIR. Care is much more people and purpose oriented, whereas the FAIR data principles are much more data oriented. Some things to think about also is the history and the background of the care data principles. And these are coming from many decades of, part of the context here is many decades of work in policy work in advancing the interests of indigenous peoples. So these are around, those interests are around issues of, say, political sovereignty. There are other conventions that have applied to Indigenous peoples, especially around to the protection of tangible cultural heritage, and also intangible cultural heritage. And this is really the aspect of intangible cultural heritage is one of the first places where I engaged with care types of issues with that paper that we did in 2005 with Jason Schultz and Arash Bissell. And then finally, the care data principles is sort of synthesizing a lot of these frameworks, these policy initiatives, and describing them in terms of data ethics and data principles. And a really useful summary of that was published recently by Ramona Nicholas and Neha Gupta on in the Conservation Perspectives, the Getty Conservation newsletter. And the phrase "nothing about us without us" is an important way, sort of summary of the care data principles. So we'll explore that just now. So care data, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics is sort of based on that prior history that I showed of policy initiatives in different venues and to advance the interests of Indigenous peoples. And again, this is focused on data concerns. And when you're thinking about Indigenous data, the way that Carol and colleagues have sort of summarized what Indigenous data interests are, they're very far-reaching. So it's it's about environment, landscapes, resources, interactions with non-human entities like animals, plants, other parts of the landscape. But it's also about institutions, administration, populations, their health, their commercial interests, and finally, especially important for archaeology, traditional culture sites, clan knowledge, and belongings and stories. So it encompasses a huge range of issues. And one thing I want to highlight is that the collective benefit aspects of it, and there's, we don't really have time to go through every part of the care principles, but I want to focus a little bit on collective benefit and thinking about the design of information infrastructure and data ecosystems. Basically, the purpose-driven part of this is that they need to benefit Indigenous peoples. And some of the ways that Carol and colleagues have discussed about how they can benefit Indigenous peoples is the really for inclusive development and innovation, so that the data and the infrastructures that are managing those data are available, accessible, and used to promote capacity of Indigenous peoples, to promote the capacity of Indigenous peoples, that they are leading in the governance, and as the Indigenous peoples are engaging with these things, and as some of this data are interfacing between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities, one of the purposes there is to improve transparency in the decision making, especially if as Indigenous communities negotiate and work with outside communities. And again, the whole point to this is to promote equitable outcomes so that Indigenous people benefit from the from the management of data about them. So some of these things, in some ways, there's a lot of discussion about use and reuse of transparency, and that is where actually the care principles and the FAIR principles actually have some fairly close alignment, in the sense that use and reuse is one of the core goals of the FAIR principles, is to promote use and reuse of data. Transparency is also one of the core goals of the FAIR data principles. But the key difference between FAIR and CARE is FAIR doesn't really specify transparency, and reuse doesn't really care about who does it, where the CARE principles is really emphasizing the who who is benefiting from their use and reuse, and the who of the care principles is indigenous peoples. So again, that's one of the main areas of alignment and some of the areas of tension, because whereas FAIR is promoting unencumbered data that's fungible, that is reusable just broadly without a lot of concern about who's actually doing that reuse, the care principles are really emphasizing who is benefiting from all of that. And also the care principles like to reinforce the notion of continuous social connections and responsibilities in amongst data creators, data managers, and data reusers. And so it's that continuous social connection responsibility between peoples, communities, and data that is one of the things that is very different between FAIR and CARE. So in the sense that CARE is anti-alienation. CARE works against the notion that data just is sort of out there without and unencumbered is best. CARE wants to see those connections maintained and wants to see those responsibilities maintained. So now let's get into some of the areas of alignment. A lot of the ways in which we want to promote FAIR and CARE actually are have a lot in common. So open source infrastructures and toolings, those can serve FAIR agendas and CARE agendas, and so it's good data management practices work in both sides. And so that's what I'd like to just finish off with. And one of the main things to consider is that good data management, especially if you want to promote ethics, as in with the CARE principles, that is not there's no excuse to be sloppy or lazy in your data management practices, the technical excellence of your data management practices. So naming, identifiers, clear understanding about sensitivities and protections, using appropriate vocabularies. These things are obviously important for FAIR. They're also essential for CARE implementations. That is, whether or not your data are open or closed, you need these to have really good practices in these sort of core aspects of data management in order to serve the needs of CARE as well as FAIR. So this, just saying that you're you want to promote CARE data gives you no excuse for doing anything sloppy on a technical matter either. So really briefly, one of the things that I'd like to highlight with this is, and some interesting areas of other interesting areas of potential overlap are in the notion of persistent identifiers. Persistent identifiers are names of things that have some sort of longer term institutional support, some sort of infrastructure backing behind them. So you're probably familiar with DOIs in the world of publication. A DOI is a document object identifier, and that is a persistent identifier for, say, an article or a book or something like that. And those identifiers are form the basis of citation and citation networks in scholarly communications. And so lots of data sets and lots of data entities also receive DOIs. There are other forms of persistent identifiers. Another commonly used one is something called an ARK, an archival resource key. But the specific thing about them that's important is that they're cross-platform. They're not just part of one software infrastructure. They're supported by multiple institutions working in collaboration around the world. And it's to maintain associations, relationships between information, across information sets. And what's important about that is that they help communicate context and provenance and the associations between some information and maybe communities or rules, expectations that those communities have about that information. That is something that is very much a core of the CARE principles. It's that notion that communities have a continuous and ongoing interest with data, and that there are continuous and ongoing responsibilities associated with data as a core aspect of CARE. So how do you actually implement that in a working information system? One of the core needs is persistent identifiers, because that helps manage and maintain those connections. So provenance and context can be maintained with those connections using persistent IDs. And we have an article, Sarah Kansa and I have an article that describes some of these things, especially in the context of archaeological data management. So there are some challenges, though. Okay, so there are important issues around implementing care, putting it into practice. One of the hardest challenges is scaling trust. Lots of the best practice examples that you're going to see about engaging and promoting Indigenous data sovereignty really come from long-term development of personal relationships, building trust, and engaging with Indigenous communities. And this is under the assumption that you yourself aren't Indigenous and you're not already part of that community. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of real investment to build up those relationships and to develop those kinds of collaborations. And then how do you scale that for large-scale information management? That is an unanswered question, and that's a big, important challenge. And obviously, in order to do all of that, you also need funding, because in order to build the trust relationships, you need to have the resources in order to be able to engage in these kinds of partnerships over long periods of time, where there's uncertainty and risk as to what the outcomes will be. And also, if you really want to implement the care data principles properly, Indigenous peoples themselves, Indigenous communities themselves need to manage their own infrastructure, need to manage their own data, because they're the best stewards of their own information. That requires actual resources. So this is a core capacity. There's a capacity issue that is a major challenge in actually promoting care. Finally, I just want to highlight that the care data principles are absolutely essential. It's one of the core aspects of good practice. They are necessary, but they may not necessarily be sufficient. And for a lot of the work that your own projects are doing, there are really interesting kinds of questions about whether or not care is the final answer towards the question about ethical data management. Care is specifically designed around Indigenous data sovereignty. It is not designed to meet the needs of other marginalized communities. And there are many other important marginalized communities, which we also have ethical responsibilities to promote their interests. So diaspora communities, refugees, other groups that face, say, structural violence of one sort or another, they're not specifically addressed by the care data principles. And so you have to be very careful about, are you applying a set of principles designed to meet the needs of one constituency? How do you adapt them to meet the needs of other communities that we also have ethical responsibilities to support? And obviously, there are also appropriation risks. So nationalist, neo-fascist movements can and do appropriate the language of Indigenous rights. And they do it for nefarious purposes, bad purposes, to undermine human rights. And so when we're implementing something like the care principles, we have to be very careful about how do we guard against risks of appropriation, that work that we're doing to try to promote ethics is not going to be used for work that is serving authoritarian kinds of agendas. And then finally, so one of the bigger questions here that we still need to explore is, do we need a broader set of data principles that include care and also try to address some of these other kinds of needs, especially around diaspora and refugee communities. So with that, I hope I didn't go on too long, but I wanted to thank you all for being part of this conversation. And yeah, that's it. And thank you so much to Rebecca and colleagues for organizing all this. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eric, very much for that wonderful overview and introduction to our session. If anybody has any immediate questions, do please raise your hand or write it in the chat. But If not, we'll move on to what is, I suppose, the second part of the talk, which is going to be given by Neha Gupta, who can't be here due to the time difference. So I'm going to play a recording.